why the narcissist never moves on from a super empath. And I want to begin with the word never, because it is the most specific and the most consequential word in this title, and the one that most people hearing this topic will instinctively want to qualify. Never feels absolute. Never feels like a claim that is vulnerable to the obvious counterexample. The narcissist who appears to have moved on completely, who has a new relationship and a visible life, and no apparent indication that the super empath they left or lost is occupying any significant portion of their psychological landscape. And if the never in this title meant that the narcissist sits somewhere visibly pining, obviously unhealed, publicly demonstrating the weight of the loss in ways that are legible to anyone observing, then yes, the counterexample would be valid, and the never would be an overstatement. But the never in this title does not mean that. It means something considerably more specific and considerably more interior than that. It means that the specific thing the super empath did to the narcissist's psychological architecture, the specific alteration she produced in how the narcissist experiences every subsequent relationship, every subsequent supply source, every subsequent attempt to rebuild the supply economy that the relationship with her disrupted. That alteration does not reverse, does not heal in the way that the new relationship's presence suggests it has healed, does not become unavailable as a comparison point regardless of how many new people are acquired and how enthusiastically the acquisition is performed. The narcissist moves forward. They always move forward. The forward motion is the primary mechanism through which the narcissist system manages every loss, and the super empath's departure is no exception to the rule that forward motion will be sought and found and performed with convincing enthusiasm. But moving forward is not the same as moving on. And the difference between those two things, in the specific case of the super empath, is the entire content of this episode. So stay with me, because what we are about to discuss is the most complete account available of what actually happens inside the narcissist's psychology after the super empath is gone. And it is not the account that either the narcissist's performance or the simple narratives about this dynamic would suggest. Let's start with what makes the super empath specifically and categorically different from every other person the narcissist has been in a significant relationship with, because the never requires this foundation, and without it the never is just a satisfying claim rather than a psychologically grounded observation. The narcissist has had other significant relationships, has had other people who were genuinely perceptive, genuinely caring, genuinely invested in the relationship at depth, has had people who were intelligent and sensitive and capable of real connection in ways that most people are not. None of those people produced the never. And understanding why the super empath produces it when they did not requires understanding the specific quality that distinguishes the super empath from everyone else in the narcissist's relational history. Not just the depth of feeling, not just the sensitivity, not just the quality of connection that the relationship contained at its best. The specific quality is the accuracy of the perception combined with the persistence of the caring. Most people who are perceptive enough to begin seeing through the narcissist's construction eventually stop caring, because what the perception reveals is sufficient to eliminate the caring, or at least to reduce it to a level where it no longer functions as the specific kind of supply that the actual self underneath the construction was responding to. The perception and the caring move in opposite directions. As one increases, the other decreases, in the natural progression of most relationships with narcissists, until the point where the perception is complete enough and the caring is diminished enough that the relationship ends from a place that makes sense to both people. The super empath does not follow this progression. The super empath's perception increases and the caring persists. Not the caring for the constructed self. That caring was always more complicated, more qualified, more organized around hope than around certainty. The caring for the actual self underneath the construction. The specific, accurate perception, informed caring that the super empath extends toward the wounded, defended, largely inaccessible actual self of the narcissist, even as the perception of the construction becomes increasingly complete and increasingly uncharitable. This combination, seeing everything and still caring about what is underneath everything, is the specific thing the narcissist has never encountered before and will never encounter again in the specific form the super empath provided it. And its absence after the super empath is gone is the specific thing the never is organized around. Now let's talk about what the narcissist encounters in every subsequent relationship that makes the moving on impossible regardless of how convincing the performance of moving on appears to the outside world. Because the never is not about the narcissist being unable to find new supply. The supply is found. The new relationships are acquired. The love bombing cycle restarts with the specific enthusiasm that new supply at peak production always generates in the narcissist system. All of that happens efficiently and often quickly, because the narcissist's ability to attract new supply is one of the most intact functions of their psychology and is frequently accelerated rather than diminished by the disruption of a significant relationship. The never is not about the supply being unavailable. It is about what the supply consistently and without exception fails to provide. And what it fails to provide is the specific quality of reception that the super empath's perception produced when it was directed at the actual self underneath the construction. Every new supply source provides the narcissist with what new supply has always provided: the admiration of the presented self, the confirmation of the construction, the specific regulatory hit that comes from someone encountering the charming, capable, impressive version of the narcissist for the first time and responding to it with the full force of someone who has not yet developed the perception to see past it. This provision is real. It is genuinely regulatory. It does the job it has always done in the narcissist psychological economy. And underneath it, running at a frequency that the new supply cannot reach and that the narcissist system cannot simply decide to stop registering, is the comparison. The specific, involuntary, continuously operating comparison between what the new supply is providing and what the super empath provided that the new supply is not providing. Not the admiration. The new supply often provides more admiration than the super empath provided at the equivalent stage, because the super empath's admiration was always complicated by the accuracy of her perception in ways that pure admiration without perception is not. What the new supply is not providing is the specific thing that was underneath the admiration in the relationship with the super empath. The quality of being known, of the actual self being reached by someone who could reach it, of the genuine, accurate, perception-informed caring that the super empath extended toward what was actually there rather than what was presented. That quality is not available from new supply. It is structurally unavailable because it requires the specific combination of perceptive capacity and persistent caring that the super empath had, and that the population of people willing to remain in a relationship with a narcissist long enough to develop it is extraordinarily small. The new supply cannot produce it because the new supply does not yet have the perception to produce it, and by the time the perception develops, the caring will have diminished in the way that most people's caring diminishes when the perception becomes accurate. The super empath is the exception. The supply landscape is full of the rule, and the narcissist, moving through the rule, governed supply landscape in the aftermath of the exception, finds the rule less satisfying than it was before the exception made itself available as a comparison point. This is the beginning of the never. The comparison that does not stop operating. The standard that the subsequent supply landscape consistently and without exception fails to meet, and what this does to the narcissist's experience of every subsequent relationship, and the specific behaviors it produces that the people in those relationships observe without understanding, and the moments when the never becomes most acutely present in the narcissist's interior experience. That is exactly where we are going next. What the continuous comparison does to the narcissist's experience of subsequent relationships is something that is almost impossible for the narcissist to consciously acknowledge, because conscious acknowledgement would require the self-awareness that the construction was specifically built to prevent. The narcissist cannot say, even to themselves in the private moments when the defenses are at their lowest, I am measuring every new person against her and finding them insufficient. The conscious acknowledgement of that comparison would require acknowledging several things simultaneously that the narcissist's psychological architecture cannot hold together without significant structural disruption. That the super empath saw something real, that what she saw was worth seeing, that the actual self she was directing her caring toward is real and has needs that the new supply is not meeting, and that the relationship with her ended because of something in the narcissist rather than something in the circumstances or in her. That cluster of acknowledgments is precisely what the construction was built to prevent. So the comparison does not arrive as a conscious, articulable recognition. It arrives as what the narcissist experiences as a persistent quality of dissatisfaction with the current supply that they cannot source to its actual origin. A flatness underneath the new relationship's surface excitement. A quality of the new person being slightly less interesting than they seemed initially, slightly less able to hold the narcissist's attention across time, slightly less capable of producing the specific quality of engagement that keeps the narcissist genuinely present rather than going through the motions of the dynamic, while some part of their attention is elsewhere. This flatness is not what most people would recognize as missing someone. It is not grief in any form the narcissist has language for or permission to feel. It is more like a recalibration of what interesting means. A background awareness that interesting used to mean something that included a quality that the current interesting does not include, without the ability to name the quality or trace the awareness to its source. The specific behaviors this produces in subsequent relationships are worth naming, because they are often deeply confusing to the people in those relationships who observe them without the context that would make them understandable. The narcissist in the relationship that follows the super empath is more likely to test the new person's perception in ways that were not characteristic of their pre-super empath relational behavior. Not consciously. Not with the explicit intention of finding out whether the new person can see past the construction in the way the super empath could, but with the specific quality of someone whose actual self has been reached before, and who, without conscious awareness of what they are doing, occasionally presents something more genuine than the construction and interactions with the new person, something closer to the actual self, and then monitors the new person's response to the more genuine presentation with an attention and a specificity that the new person cannot account for. When the new person's response to the more genuine presentation is the response of someone who is still primarily responding to the construction, who did not notice the shift, who responded to the more genuine moment as though it were simply another moment in the performance, something in the narcissist system registers a specific quality of disappointment that has nothing to do with the new person's failing, with everything to do with the comparison that is operating in the background. The new person cannot see past the construction the way the super empath could, and the not seeing, which would have been entirely unremarkable before the super empath made the seeing available, is now a specific absence that registers as a specific quality of aloneness in the narcissist's interior experience. The aloneness of being with someone who is responding to the performance rather than to the person, which is, with painful irony, the aloneness that the narcissist's own construction has always guaranteed, and that the super empath was the only person who ever successfully interrupted. The interruption is gone, the construction is intact, the aloneness it guarantees has resumed, and the narcissist, without the framework to understand what they are experiencing, or the self-awareness to trace it to its actual source, experiences it as the new relationship being somehow insufficient in a way they cannot articulate. And insufficient relationships, in the narcissist supply economy, produce the familiar forward motion toward the next source, which will also be insufficient, in the same specific way, for the same specific reason. And the pattern will continue, each new source providing the admiration that the construction attracts and failing to provide the knowing that the super empath's perception produced, until the narcissist has moved through half a landscape to have accumulated enough evidence of the pattern that even the narcissist's defenses cannot entirely prevent the pattern from becoming visible. And what happens when the pattern finally becomes visible, even partially, even in the defended, unexplored way that the narcissist system permits visibility, and why that visibility consistently produces the specific behavior toward the super empath that most people recognize as the never making itself known. That is exactly where we are going next. What happens when the pattern finally becomes visible, even in the partial, defended, never quite fully examined way that the narcissist system permits visibility, is one of the most psychologically revealing sequences available in the entire arc of this dynamic. And it happens not as a single moment of recognition, but as an accumulation of smaller moments in which the comparison that has been running in the background of every subsequent relationship finally reaches a threshold where the background cannot contain it anymore, where the flatness of the current supply against the memory of what the super empath provided becomes acute enough that the forward motion, the reliable, efficient, supply-seeking forward motion that has managed every previous relational difficulty, stops being sufficient to prevent the comparison from becoming conscious. Not fully conscious, not with the clarity and the honesty that would constitute genuine self-awareness, but conscious enough to produce behavior, conscious enough to generate the reaching, and the reaching, when it comes, is different from the ordinary hoovering that the narcissist directs toward previous supply sources whose potential for renewed supply makes contact worth attempting. The reaching toward the super empath has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the standard hoovering sequence, a quality that the super empath, with her specific perceptive capacity, is almost always able to detect even when the narcissist is not fully aware of it themselves. The reaching has the quality of someone who is not entirely sure what they are reaching for, who knows at some level that is below conscious articulation that what they are reaching toward is something that cannot be named in the supply, seeking vocabulary that has structured every previous reach, who is reaching not for the supply that the relationship provided in its ordinary operation, but for something that was only available in the relationship's extraordinary moments. The windows when the construction stepped back and the conceived self was briefly present, the reception was directed it with the specific quality of caring that the actual self has ever or since. The reaching has the quality of someone reaching for those windows, not knowing that is what they are reaching for, but reaching for it nonetheless. And the super empath receives the reaching with the full force of her perceptive capacity and feels the quality of what is underneath it. Before she has processed what is on the surface, she feels the actual self reaching, not the construction doing supply seeking. The actual self reaching for the one witness it has ever had. And that feeling, the feeling of the actual self reaching through the narcissist's contact, with the specific desperation of something that has been without witnessing for as long as the absence of the super empath has lasted, is all the most difficult things the super empath will ever be asked to receive without being moved by it in the direction of return. Because here is the specific and most important thing to understand about the reaching when it comes from this place. When it is the actual self-reaching rather than the construction supply, seeking, or when it is both simultaneously as it usually is, because the narcissist psychology does not permit the actual self to operate entirely independently of the construction, even in the moments when the actual self's need is most acute. The reaching being genuine, in the sense that the actual self's need is genuinely driving it, does not mean that returning to the relationship would produce something different from what the relationship produced before. It does not mean that the narcissist has done the work, or is ready to do the work, or has even fully acknowledged that work is required. It means that the actual self's need has finally become sufficiently acute that the construction's management of it is temporarily insufficient, and temporarily insufficient is not structurally changed. The construction will reassert itself. The supply seeking will resume its primary role. The dynamic that produced the super empath departure will be available to reproduce itself as soon as the initial intensity of the reunion has settled into the ordinary functioning of the relationship that the construction governs. The reaching being real does not make the return safe. And the super empath who has developed the specific perceptive capacity that made the narcissist unable to move on from her is also, if she is operating from the fullness of that capacity, the super empath most equipped to read this distinction accurately, to feel the actual self-reaching and to understand simultaneously that the actual self-reaching is not the same as the actual self being ready. That being reached for and being returned to are two different things with two different sets of requirements, and that the requirements for the second are not met by the evidence that the first has occurred. Now let's talk about what the never actually looks like in the long arcs, not just in the immediate aftermath of the super empath's departure, and not just in the specific moments when the pattern becomes visible enough to produce reaching, but across the years and sometimes decades that the never operates in the narcissist's psychology as a quiet, persistent background condition of their relational life. Because the never is not only a feature of the early post-departure period, it is a permanent structural feature of the narcissist's subsequent relational experience, and it expresses itself differently at different points in the timeline in ways that are worth understanding because they are consistently misread by the people who observe them. In the early period, the first months after the super empath's departure, the never expresses itself primarily through the acceleration we discussed, the conspicuous forward motion and the new supply's enthusiastic acquisition. In the middle period, the months and years in which the subsequent supply landscape is being navigated with increasing evidence of its specific insufficiency, the never expresses itself primarily through the flatness we discussed, the quality of dissatisfaction that runs underneath each new relationship's surface, and that produces the specific pattern of shorter satisfaction cycles and more frequent replacements that characterizes the narcissist supply-seeking behavior in this period. And in the later period, the period that arrives when enough time and enough evidence have accumulated that even the narcissist's defenses cannot entirely prevent the pattern from registering as a pattern, the never expresses its specific and most distinctive form. It expresses itself as a specific relationship the narcissist has with the memory of the super empath that is unlike any relationship they have with any other memory in their relational history. The memory of the super empath does not function like other memories in the narcissist's psychological landscape. Other memories of former relationships undergo the retrospective devaluation that the discard or the ending requires. They are edited, diminished, recontextualized in ways that make them more comfortable to hold, and less likely to complicate the forward motion that the narcissist system depends on. The memory of the super empath resists this editing. Not because the narcissist does not attempt the devaluation. The devaluation is attempted, sometimes extensively, with the full deployment of the fault, finding and the retrospective criticism, and the narrative of the relationship's inadequacy that the devaluation process typically produces. But the devaluation does not fully take. It produces something that looks like the devalued memory when the narcissist is operating at the level of their ordinary conscious self-presentation. But that reveals, in the unguarded moments, in the private experiences that the construction cannot entirely manage, a quality that is different from every other devalued memory. The memory of the super empath still carries the actual self's experience of being known, and the actual self's experience of being known cannot be retrospectively devalued in the same way that the experience of admiration or connection or supply production can be devalued, because the knowing was not directed at the construction. The construction can be devalued, but the actual self's experience of being met cannot be rewritten into something smaller or less significant, without doing something to the actual self that the actual self will not permit, without the kind of resistance that only is in the unguarded moments, and that is one of the most genuinely human things the narcissist experiences. The memory of being known persists, and it persists not as a comfortable, nostalgic warmth, but as a specific, unresolvable ache in the part of the narcissist's psychology that was reached and is now unreached. The ache is the never made internal, the never that operates not as a behavioral pattern or a supply calculation or a reaching that might be observed from the outside, but as a private, permanent, never fully articulated awareness that lives in the actual self, the one the super empath saw, for as long as the actual self exists, which is to say always, which is to say never moving on, which is exactly what the title promised, and which is now, having been traced from its origin in the supply economics of the discard through its expression in the subsequent supply landscape, through its appearance in the reaching, through its persistence in the devaluation, persistent memory. Exactly what it has been shown to be, not a performance of missing, not a strategic calculation about return. The permanent, structural, psychologically foundational condition of a self that was reached once, genuinely and accurately and with the specific caring that the super empath provided, and that has been unreached ever since. And that knowledge, the knowledge that the super empath carries about what she provided and what its absence has produced in the narcissist's interior life, is not an invitation to return. It is not a reason to soften the clarity that the departure required. It is simply the most complete and most honest account of what happened in that relationship at the level that matters most. What happened at the level of the actual self, underneath everything the construction managed, in the windows when the actual self was briefly present and genuinely met. Something real happened there. Something that the narcissist system was not designed to metabolize and has not metabolized and will not metabolize. And the super empath who knows this can hold the knowledge with the specific quality of compassion that her nature makes available. Compassion for the actual self that was there, that was worth knowing, that the construction ultimately made unknowable on any sustained basis, without letting that compassion become the reason to return to the conditions that made the knowing impossible to sustain. The compassion and the boundary are not opposites. In the super empath who has fully arrived at herself, they are the same thing expressed from the same place. The place that sees completely and chooses carefully and loves what is real without requiring what is real to be available in a form that it is not currently capable of taking. That is the super empath at her most complete. And the narcissist who cannot move on from her is, in the most honest and most specific sense, available, unable to move on from exactly that.